Okay, welcome to this recording of the Wednesday morning session. And since I'm a little lonely here with no student joining me, I still wanted to record this so you have a chance to check if you are revising using the study guide, so you'll get those answers. But we're probably going to work through this a little quicker since it's just me today. So today's main focus will be on this reviewing the material from the study guide, but we'll also peek and have a look at a couple of other things. Biggest thing that I want to highlight that is that you should be very, very pleased. You're on the last week of teaching on this course, so week 17, and next week we simply have the finals project to complete. And like I said, the finals, we don't have an exam, we instead have a project, and I'll be releasing the information about that project next week. It really is something that shouldn't take too much time from you, and it's all as an extra credit activity, so it only positively impacts your overall grade. I also wanted to say that there are no assignments this week. What you will be focusing is the exam 4 and practical 4. Try to get those in because it's really important that you get all of those possible points that you might collect so that you can really get the good final grade that you deserve. This is also a great week to catch up on any assignments that you might have missed, so I really encourage you to contact me if you need anything open. So I'm asking you to get the exam 4 and lab practical 4 completed by the end of the week, which I believe the Sunday is May 16th. So before the midnight. And as you see, they add up to quite a nice pot of points. There is a study guide for exam 4, and that's really what we're going to be doing for the majority of this session. And having said that, let's see if I can jump off from this presentation, and we will then continue with the study guide. So bear with me for a second. And you should be now able to see the study guide for exam 4. So on this study guide, we will go through the digestive system, and we'll also have a look of the male and female reproductive systems and some general concepts. How the study guide works is as before. We will spend time going through the answers and important concepts that you might want to know in terms of the exam. And on this video, I will be also sharing information about the extra credit activity or extra credit question that you have on the exam. So it might be worth listening into that. But what we're going to do, we're going to start with the digestive system. So let's go through that, and there's quite a lot that we can cover on that. And in terms of how these systems are connected to each other, why a digestive system ties into nicely of things that we've been talking so far, we will notice that really the function of the digestive system is to take these sugars and convert them into ATP, which was the cellular energy currency. And this conversion process took place in the mitochondria of the cell. So that's really what your digestive system tries to do. It tries to make sure that we get the energy and also the nutrients that we need for the body. And of course, to do that, we needed to get rid of the carbon dioxide and water that were produced as a byproduct. And for that, we used, for example, the respiration and also urinary system. So that's how those systems that we have seen before relate to things that we're covering on this chapter. But really, I think that the important thing is always to maintain kind of the big picture. No system works alone from without the others. And let's have a look at some of the functions of the digestive system. And the functions that I want to highlight for you is that, first of all, of course, we need to take the food in somehow. So we are finding a route to get that material that we're going to be working, to get it in. And we also need to eliminate any of those remains of the food that we cannot digest. So anything that's not useful for us, those are the things that we get rid of as well. So those are two that are very, very obvious. And the next two, they're also they're actually even more so, I would say, important concepts in terms of what are the functions of the digestive system. So I really want you to pay attention to those. So first of all, the food that we take in, it's too large for us to be able to utilize as it is. It's too large to cross those plasma membranes and really make its way inside the body. So first step that we'll end up noticing that needs to happen for that to happen after taking the food in is that we need to digest that. And what digestion means, it refers to the process of breaking large food molecules into smaller components that we can then pass across that plasma membrane. The second term and second concept that I want to introduce is that now these small molecules are able to pass into the blood or into the lymphatic system if we had those large dietary fats. But once we've made them small enough, they are able to do that crossing from across the plasma membranes so that they actually enter what I consider into the body. And that process was known as absorption. So these are two really important concepts, and I would really like to make sure that you are familiar of them. If you're not, I encourage you to revisit our actual lecture videos on the chapter where we covered those. But just to kind of recap or emphasize that again, let's do a quick drawing of a digestive tract. And this is a really simplified. So here's our mouth, and then we have our esophagus, our stomach, our small intestines, our large intestines, and then there we have our anus, where the material that we cannot use comes out. And then we have the rest of the body kind of around all this. And now if I'm coloring in rest of the body with this green color, and I know that this is going to be a little bit of a sketchy drawing, but hopefully it will help to clarify this concept. And if it doesn't, don't worry. I think that the lecture video does a really good job of that. I would then justify for you just refer back to that. So what we will see on this diagram, and what's the important point that I'm really trying to push on this, is that our body, if it's this green colored blob that we see here, it actually has this channel inside it. And this channel is the digestive tract. And as you notice, it starts from the mouth, ends up to the anus, and it's one continuous tube inside our body. So material that's within this tube has not yet crossed, if you wish, inside us. It has not crossed that membrane that separates the inside from the outside. So let's just review what we just learned. Here we have a large food piece. It goes to our mouth. It gets broken into smaller pieces. And this breaking it into smaller pieces, it can be chemical or it can be actually physically breaking it down. But no matter how we break it into smaller pieces, that process was known as digestion. And sometimes that process can take place at the level of the mouth. Sometimes the food needs to travel further along the digestive tract to the stomach or small intestines. But we have these same materials there. For the sake of making the drawing a little bit clearer, we assume now that these smaller components, smaller molecules in the stomach are then making their way to the small intestines. And from there, they are actually able to cross inside the body. So now they can go to all parts of the body with the blood circulation or the lymphatic system. And that's how we are able to make them available for our cells. So this process where they are actually doing this crossing of the membrane and really getting into the body, this was known as absorption. So I hope that that helps to clarify these two concepts. And like I said, if you're still a little bit confused, I strongly encourage you that do not hesitate to go back to the lecture videos. This is supposed to be just a review session, so I don't have a chance to cover every concept in great detail. The next thing that I wanted to mention about the digestive tract was that we have two types of movements that I want us to be familiar with. And let me just get the correct pen that I want to use. I think this will work just fine. So I want to talk with you guys about two types of movements that we see within the digestive tract. And we've seen these terms being used before, but I don't think we've really ever spent significant time on them. So they're going to come on this chapter. And the first term that I want to talk with you guys is the peristalsis. What happens in peristalsis? It's all about moving the material along this tube that we had. So it started from one end and continued to the other end. And in peristalsis, the material moves along this tube. So this is something that's often described as a wave-like movement. And what I mean by that is that on this tube that we have here, the muscles contract in a synchronized manner, one after another. And as they contract in this way, they push the food that's in front of them along this tract to this direction. So it really works great for moving materials along the tube. The second type of movement that we have is segmentation. And segmentation differs now from peristalsis. The big thing there is that there's not so much moving stuff. It's about breaking down and mixing materials. So these movements are not synchronized so that they would go into any particular direction. So here we have the tube again, and nothing is really moving out or in thanks to the segmentation. Instead, what happens is that these muscle bands that we saw earlier on, they contract at random places. And then since they are contracting at random places, we don't really have pushing the food to a certain direction. What happens rather that segmentation is good at physically breaking down where the muscle band contracts and also mixing a little bit locally as the material moves back and forth. So that's the big difference between those two. And I really would like to encourage you to make sure that you do know the difference between the two, because those, like we saw earlier on, those movements we find in many parts of the body, not just in terms of the digestive system. They're useful ones to know. And having covered those, I think that we're ready to look at something that I think is a very core concept of the digestive tract. What we find is that digestive tract was this tube that we had a look of earlier on here at the very beginning. It started from one end, ended to another end, but it's all one continuous tube. And at some parts, this tube is, of course, wider than in other parts. In some parts, it might be more wigglier than in other parts, it's more straight. But regardless, it is one continuous tube. And all along this tube, we end up finding that there are 4 main layers that we find in all parts, regardless whether it's a really wide or a very narrow part of this tract. But there are 4 layers that we always find. And I think that that's a really, really interesting concept and something that we should be aware of. And these 4 layers are sometimes referred as tunicas. So if you think of what a tunica is in terms of clothing, it's a layer that you put on top of other layers. So these are layers. So we're going to go through the 4 important layers that I would like for you to be comfortable with. And let's start with the first layer. And I just want to highlight here that you remember the term lumen. Lumen referred to the center of a tube, whether it's a blood vessel or in this case, a digestive tract tube. But it's the center of some sort of a tube. So we're working our way starting from the middle, working outwards. And the first layer that we're going to have a look of is mucosal layer. And this mucosal layer lines right against of all this material that passes through this tube. So its function is then going to be to protect materials or protect the wall against the materials that move along there. So if you can think of that here we have more of a 3-dimensional view of this tube, and material moves along it. As the material is moving along, there's a good chance that sometimes there's some a little more coarser parts of the food or elements that are passing through. So this mucosal layer makes sure that it doesn't scratch the other layers that are underneath. So it forms this protective function on inside the tube. The other thing that we notice, there's a lot of secretions coming out from this layer. And what we'll see, for example, is that a lot of glands, their ducts open up here. The glands themselves are not usually on this level, but their ducts open there. The final thing that I wanted to say that, of course, this layer is really good also for absorbing. Let's see if I can draw an arrow here. My screen is sometimes a little sensitive. So it helps with taking in the materials from inside the tube. So it's really important that this layer is something that the materials can cross also well so that we're able to do this job. So materials the tube gets protected, but also materials get put in and taken in from the tube. So that was our mucosal layer. The next layer that we're going to look at is going to be our submucosal layer. And I think that this name is really good at describing where we find this layer. So it's below the mucosa. That's what the sub means. Underneath something, below the mucosa. And let's have a look what sort of things we might want to notice of that. So first thing that you'll notice is that there's going to be a lot of glands within this layer. So I mentioned earlier on that when we had glands, these glands are normally located within the submucosal layer, but their ducts come through the mucosal layer so that they can empty their contents then to the lumen of the tube. So we'll end up finding various glands on this layer that we're just having a look of. So submucosal layer. Another thing that we end up finding on this layer is that there's going to be various different kinds of blood vessels and also nerves in there. So if you want, we can add them to this diagram if that helps you to remember those. So here would be an artery coming in. We could add also a vein carrying blood out like that. That's nice. And the thing that we saw there was that there were nerves running here. Well, all of this, having blood supply, having nerves, it tells us that we have a very good control within this layer and control especially of those glands. So the function is very, very physiological for this layer as we see. The next structure that I want to talk about is going to be our muscular layer. And we talk about as if it was one layer, but in reality, there's always two layers present here. So we have the innermost layer, which is circular. So you'll notice as we color that in to this diagram, these are muscle fibers that you can see as dotted lines. So these are going around. If this is our tube, our vessel, they go around it. So in this, oh, I didn't mean to have highlighter on. I meant to have a pen on. So in this direction, they circle this tube. And by doing that, they can do this squeezing and extending the tube, controlling its diameter. As we saw, that would be then important on ensuring that we can do all these kinds of movements that we discussed. The kind of a deeper or furthermost layer that we see, the outermost layer, is going to be longitudinal muscle fibers. And we can see a cross section of them here as well. So they look very different. There's going to be something that's different from what we earlier on saw. So these muscle fibers would actually run along the length of the tube. So if this is the tube, they run along this way. So they're able to extend or shrink this tube a little bit. So that's what they do. And you might notice that I've listed there a third one, and this is going to be the oblique layer. Well, oblique layer is found only in one and only one part of the digestive tract, and that's within the stomach. And if we think why that might be relevant, so I've drawn here a really sketchy bad drawing of a stomach. And we saw that stomach had also these circular fibers, these longitudinal fibers, but then we find this third type of fibers, which are oblique. So they go not parallel to any of these other fibers that we've seen. And these are important because stomach's function is really to mix the material, especially with the stomach acids that are there. So that's why we have this third kind of a layer present there. So it's a little bit special in that sense. And I think that we are now good to have a look of our last and final layer for this diagram. And this last and final layer that we're going to discuss about is going to be called serosa. And what serosa does, it's made of connective tissue. And if you think back when we talked about connective tissues, what connective tissues do, they always connected things. So in this case, it works as an anchoring structure. It makes sure that this tube stays where it's supposed to stay. So that's what it does. What's its function as a layer. So it connects it to so that it stays on its place. And then we have rest of the things that we find behind that are body tissues. So I hope that this review of the 4 important layers of the digestive tract wall has helped you. And next, I want to mention just a couple of concepts. We're not going to dwell on these too much. These are concepts that are worth of noticing, but not necessarily the only thing worth of noticing. So I want to talk about a term peritoneum first. And one thing that we've noticed already before was that our cavities in the body were lined by these layers that separated them from other cavities. So peritoneum is a serous membrane layer that lines the abdominal cavity. And if you think why this might be useful is that by making these compartments just like we saw with the heart being enclosed within the sac, the pericardial sac, we're able to make sure that if there's an infection somewhere else, it cannot spread into that structure. So if there's an infection outside the peritoneum, it wouldn't get inside. Or if there's an infection inside peritoneum, it wouldn't spread to other parts of the body. So in that sense, peritoneum is a really useful term to be familiar with. The other reason why peritoneum is something that I want you to be familiar is that, as you can notice, we often refer structures in anatomy and physiology and describing their relationships in relation to the peritoneum. So we just have a look, where are they in relation to the peritoneum? So if it's retroperitoneal, it would be behind it. And I think that kidneys are a really good example of that. If they are intraperitoneal, they're within it. So inside the peritoneum. And then we can have subperitoneal, which would be underneath the peritoneum, such as, for example, our urinary bladder would be a good example. And of course, we can have other directions, other relations in terms of the peritoneum, but those are just for you to give you an idea that really it's useful to know where the peritoneum is so that you can then figure out how structures are related in relation to that. A specific part of the peritoneum that I want to talk just quickly is called greater omentum. And it's this part that folds down and back up there. And the reason why this is an important part to know is that if you especially end up doing dissections or otherwise having to work through the layers of the abdominal cavity from most outside, so most surface layers to deeper and deeper, we end up finding this greater omentum, this membrane lining that has been folded there, and it often has a lot of small fat nodules attached to it. That's one of the first structures that we see right under the skin, fat, and muscles. So we either need to cut through it, or sometimes what happens, we just fold it up so we see the structures underneath. But that's one important anatomical landmark that you might want to notice. And talking of general concepts and concepts that I just want to make sure that you have a basic idea, I want to mention also the neural control. And now that we're talking about the digestive system, we remember that the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system was the one that's all to do with activating, with stimulating the digestive system. So the parasympathetic branch was sometimes called also rest and digest branch. So that's when everything's going well, you're just chilling, like say after you've eaten a big Thanksgiving meal, all your blood feels like it's going to the gut. It's there to catch that energy and nutrients from the food that have just consumed, and it is there to ensure that those processes take place. So that's what's active when the digestion is working optimally, digestive system is working optimally. When your sympathetic branch, which was all to do with fight and flight responses, so mainly about survival, when that's active, your digestive system is really depressed. We're not worrying about digesting stuff if we're going to die otherwise. So then the digestive system is not highly active at that case. Just a note to make. Other thing that we notice in regards to the digestive system, and if we look at especially how the blood is supplied there, we'll notice that there's a lot of blood supply. And this was so that we are able to catch the energy and nutrients from the food that we consume. And what's noteworthy is that if we consider where does the blood go from the stomach, it actually goes to our liver. With the very few exceptions, all the blood from this area is directed to the liver. And you might wonder, why would that make sense? Why is liver the structure where we're directing the blood? Well, it's because your body tissues are kind of silly. They're not very thinking ahead. What they do, they live very much in a moment, if you wish to think about it that way. If there is energy available, these tissues burn it off. They go crazy and use all that energy. And then they're like, okay, we could use some more energy. Liver, you can think of it at this level as kind of a sensible gatekeeper that since all the blood passes through it, it's actually responsible for storing some of that energy to the liver before the blood can continue to other parts of the body. So it's then able to release the energy when it is needed. So that's the function of that. And it's kind of a little point, but important point that I wanted to highlight to you. Let's start discussing our digestive tract structure by structure, and we're going to start with our mouth. So sometimes you can see that mouth is also referred as oral cavity or buccal cavity. All of those terms refer to the same thing though, so don't let that throw you off. One of the questions that I like asking from the students and that you can probably expect to come up in the exam is that I often ask, where does the digestion start? When do we actually start to digest it? What part of the digestive tract? And often I get my students telling me that, oh, it's within the mouth, or they might be more careful when the food hits the lips, or when it's in the teeth, when it's on the tongue. I would say that just a simple sight or smell or thought of the food makes most of us salivate. You can think of the Pavlov's dogs if that helps you. So anyone who has studied psychology has probably heard about the Pavlov's dogs. He conditioned these dogs so that right before he gave them food, he rang a bell, and that combination of hearing a bell and getting food then made these dogs think that whenever they heard the bell, oh, they're going to get food. So they started salivating just from the sound of this bell, even though there was no food and he might not have given any food, but they became conditioned to start to salivate. Well, similarly, just the sight, smell, or thought can trigger us to start to salivate, even though the food is not within our body yet. And saliva contains, for many digestive enzymes, for example, salivary amylase, which breaks down starches. So we're going to have a look of the functions of the mouth. Well, what the mouth does, it's first of all the entry route for the food. But there's other things that kind of are not as digestive system related, but still important. And the second one, it is in a way, I guess I should correct myself, digestive system related, that we also want to screen the food that we take into our body. So there's a lot of sensory reception happening at the mouth in terms of the taste, texture, heat, so on, so on, so on. We want to make sure that before we let that food go into the rest of our body, it is okay, it is safe, it's good to be eaten. Of course, the third function that we notice is the production of the speech, where we use mouth and other parts of the respiratory tract as well. We rely on our communication, motor humans, on the speech greatly. And I'm just going to go and get us a charging cable, so I'm not going to run out of battery. So we'll continue in a second. So here we are back. I was worried of losing you because of the computer's battery running out, but that's not going to happen now. Next thing that I wanted to do with you was to discuss a little bit about the boundaries that form the mouth. What are the different boundaries that we might want to know? So this is a good chance to also review some of the directional terminology. So anteriorly, it is our lips that's the most front part of the mouth. If we didn't have lips, the food would be just spilling out, falling out from the very front of our mouth. Laterally, we're of course going to see on the sides, the cheeks. They keep the food within nicely. Again, if they weren't there, food would be spilling out. Superiorly, the roof of the mouth, if you wish. That's going to be our palate. And you remember that we had the hard palate at the front, so that's the anterior part. And posteriorly, so back of the roof of the mouth, is soft palate. The hard palate was because there was bone within it, and soft palate does not have the bone. You can even feel that if you use your tongue to run it along the roof of your mouth. And you'll notice that at the very end, the soft palate changes to the uvula. That's the hanging bit at the back of your mouth. If you're doing this, don't choke on your tongue. I don't want to be responsible for that. Well, let's have a look of the inferior boundary of the mouth. So the floor, if you wish. So the bottom of the mouth is really formed by our tongue. So that's the large muscle group of skeletal muscle bundles that forms the bottom, the floor of the mouth. And then at the very back, so posteriorly, we have our oropharynx. So the part of the pharynx that's behind the mouth, that was called oropharynx. The part above was nasopharynx, and then we had underneath laryngopharynx. But this one is going to be the oropharynx. And what you'll notice that we'll talk about pharynx in a little more. There is an important term that I do want to introduce to you. And to do that, I'm just going to highlight that term. So term vestibule. Vestibule refers to this space between the gums and the lips. So there's this area that we have between the lips and gums and then the teeth. That space is known as vestibule, another term that you might end up seeing sometimes and that might come in useful. So I wanted to introduce that as well. Let's discuss about the tongue a little bit then. So tongue, of course, we just saw, tongue was located at the floor of the mouth. So it forms the bottom of the mouth, if you wish. And what tongue is made of? Tongue is made of the skeletal muscle. So there's bundles of skeletal muscle. These are both intrinsic and extrinsic, and the intrinsic bundles, they're responsible for the shape of the tongue, whereas extrinsic for the position. If we think of the tongue, another thing that we notice is that there's many functions for the tongue. It plays a role in gripping, repositioning, mixing material that's in our mouth. If we didn't have a tongue and we just simply chewed, we would end up chewing the same material again. So it's all about moving stuff there. So that's the first function that I wanted to discuss. Another thing that we notice is that it forms this kind of a ball-like structure, if you wish, that's easier to swallow. So when we mix food with saliva, it becomes now this ball-like, more kind of a easier to swallow structure or content. And that's where the tongue plays important role also, forming this ball. And this ball is known as bolus. So after we have mixed the food with saliva and formed it into this more of a easier digestible part, we no longer talk about food if we want to use proper terminology. We talk about bowls. So we'll come back to this later on, but be sure that you use the proper terms. The other thing that we notice is that our tongue plays role. It triggers the process of swallowing. So swallowing has to be started by tongue pushing the food backwards to the back of the mouth. So it plays role in there as well. And of course, tongue plays role in our speech, taste, and there's many other functions that we'll notice there. Couple of structures that I want to notice with you guys, and I'm going to draw a diagram. I think that will be useful here. So let's do that. Here's going to be our tongue. So it's coming out of, that's not very good. let's do that again. So what we have, I'm just going to erase all of it. What we have here, it's going to be looking at the tongue from the bottom of the tongue. The tongue is now standing up within the mouth. Here we have our gum, our teeth and gums. And then the lower lip. And same on the upper side, we've got our teeth. And as you see from my drawings, you don't have to be artistically great when you study these things, just as long as you have a rough idea what you're seeing. And our upper lip. So one thing, and I'm drawing here just a view from the top, that's our tongue. One thing that we'll notice at the top of the tongue is that there's these small dots, rounded projections. And they are what we know as papilla. You'll notice that there's few different sizes, few different arrangements. But these small rounded projections play important role in the taste sensation. So that's a structure to be aware of. The next structure, I really drew this diagram for that, if I'm honest, that I want us to be familiar with. The next structure is going to be called frenulum. Frenulum is this connective tissue band that we find in few different places, but it's worth to be able to identify. We will use some of those as anatomical landmarks later. So first of all, it runs at the bottom of the tongue to the floor of the mouth. So if you lift your tongue, you can see that long band running underneath it. That's frenulum. It also runs from at the front of the mouth, from the gums to the lower lip, and from on the upper side as well, from the gums to the upper lip. So it's this connective tissue bands. We find them in few different places, and it's going to be a good term for us to use to relate structures later. And final thing that I wanted to add to this diagram, let's add it with this pen. We have uvula, and I'm pretty sure that you've heard about that already before, but just for the sake of being complete of what we cover, you remember from the back of the soft palate, we had this hanging bit from the roof of the mouth, and this was our uvula. So I want you to know that one there. And if you touch the uvula, that often starts a gagging reflex. That also can play a role in making sure that the swallowing reflex starts. So those are few parts to know about the mouth. Let's have a look of the salivary glands there. So there's different kinds of salivary glands. We have major salivary glands and we have minor salivary glands. But we're going to start with the and focus on the major ones. And what you need to know about the salivary glands is that saliva plays many important roles for us. So I've listed here, for example, if you think they clean our mouths. For example, when you do chewing gum, it really plays to the concept that you start to salivate and that saliva cleans material away from your mouth. Also plays role in dissolving food. So not only making it smaller, but also by breaking it down, we're able to get the taste, release those chemicals for having that sensation of taste. We saw saliva forming that bolus, that ball-like structure with the food that makes it easier to swallow the food. And of course, we have certain enzymes there. So saliva also contains, for example, salivary amylase, which breaks down starches. So the breaking down food already starts at the level of the mouth. And in a single day, we do produce a lot of saliva, but that gets reused. So that's not really an issue or a concern for us. And I want to discuss about 3 salivary glands that are especially worthwhile to notice because these are the extrinsic salivary glands. So we're going to start first with what is known as parotid salivary gland. And parotid salivary gland is located here next to the ear, kind of above the masseter muscle. And if you look at it, one good way to remember the name of this and location of this is think of the old pirates that we have had that had a parrot sitting on their shoulder. Where that parrot would be, that's where the parotid salivary gland is located. So next to the ear, above the masseter. And they do have one duct each on one on each side, and that runs all the way. Oh, I wasn't meaning to do that. That runs all the way to this next to the upper second molar where it opens up. So the secretions get released next to the upper second molar. If we think about this location, this is an important location because many, for example, facial nerves run through that. So we want to be blood vessels. We want to be very careful if we have to operate on this area. So that's a challenge to keep on mind with that. The secretion, the saliva type that we get from here, that's very watery. So very liquidy. It's called serous secretions. So keep that in mind. That will become important in a bit. The next salivary gland type that I want to discuss is going to be our submandibular salivary gland. And again, the key is there in the name. it is located not so much underneath, but medial to the mandible. So it's located kind of, if your mandible curves like this, in the middle of it. You can kind of feel it if you poke from the bottom of your jaw from outside with your fingers. You can kind of have an idea where it would be. It does have one duct, and this duct opened at the base of the lingual frenulum. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Let's see if I can draw it better like this. So at the base of the tongue, at what we know as frenulum. Let's see if I can delete that. That worked great. So you might remember we talked about the lingual frenulum here. So the openings of these submandibular salivary glands would be here at the base of the lingual frenulum. So that's why we wanted to notice that we can then talk about other structures in relation to them. So that might help you a little bit. What is saliva from this is going to be? It's going to be kind of a mixture of two. It's not liquidy, it's not really sticky either. It's something in between. And then the last major extrinsic salivary gland that I want to mention, that's going to be our sublingual salivary gland. And again, I think that the name is really a great clue here as for what we should pay attention. Oh, let me just color it. I'm going to color it with pen. So it's located here underneath the tongue, as you can see. So below the tongue. And it has multiple ducts that open at the floor of the mouth. So you'll see that it differs in that way a little bit. Other thing to notice with this sublingual salivary gland is that the secretion of that is going to be very mucous. So it's very thick and sticky secretion that we get in here. So that's our extrinsic major salivary glands. We're not going to look at the minor ones. They're just within the oral cavity. And I'm going to work through the teeth actually quite quickly because that's not going to be our main topic of interest. But for the sake of completedness, I'm going to cover them as well. So whenever you're studying teeth, make your life easy, or whenever you're studying anything in A&P, you can divide the mouth into quadrants and just repeat those teeth that you learned for one quadrant into the others. And you just have to make a mirror image of it, either horizontally or vertically. So let's have a look of what different teeth do we see there. And let's start with the teeth at the very front, the anterior ones. So per each quadrant, you have two incisors. These incisors are chisel-shaped, so they're ideal for biting into things like apple and so on. So they're very, very good for that. The next one, we have only one per quadrant. That's canine. So you'll notice there are these sharp-shaped teeth that are ideal if you think of, for example, tearing meat and doing things like that. A lot of people, for aesthetic reasons, get them sanded down a little bit, but our evolutionary history can be seen from those a little bit. Then we have premolars. Premolars are kind of almost what we're going to see next. So there's kind of a transition in between of what we'll see with the molars. Sometimes they're also known as bicuspids. So that might be another term that you see being used of them. And like I said, the last three per quadrant are going to be molars. So molars are these large surfaced teeth that are ideal for putting things in between them and then bringing them lower and upper jaw together, crushing and grinding materials. We have powerful muscles for that. So that's what the molars do. If we look at the teeth very quickly, we'll notice that in a single teeth, we have a crown, which is the part that's above the gum. So there we have our enamel, which is this hard layer that covers the teeth, one of the hardest materials in the body. That's really what protects the teeth bone underneath. Bulk of the teeth is actually, I'm thinking what color to use. It's actually dentin, which is not that hard. That's why we can have decay in our teeth if the enamel layer gets damaged. And at the very center of the teeth, we have our central cavity, and there we would end up finding our blood vessels, nerves, connective tissue, things like that. So that's why it really hurts when the cavity reaches there, because there's a rich nerve supply. And when we do root canal, we try to kill that nerve there so it wouldn't hurt any. The other part of the tooth that's underneath the gum within the jawbone, that's known as the root of the tooth. So let's have a look of that just quickly, what we have there. So we have something known as cementum. You can think of it, the name almost tells that it's going to be cemented to the jawbone. And then we have also periodontal ligament, which acts in anchoring this tooth to its socket within the jawbone. So that's our teeth. And I think next we're going to talk about pharynx. So pharynx is this first part, if you wish, after the oral cavity. It's made of skeletal muscle layers, and it does have stratified squamous epithelium. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to draw again a very, very simple diagram of a side view of an individual. Here we have the nose, and then we have upper lip, and the roof of the mouth, uvula hanging there, floor of the nasal cavity. And nasal cavity continues here to the back, and then we go downwards. Let's draw our chin, lower lip. Here we see the tongue, the back of the mouth, and we go down and we divide to trachea and oesophagus. Trachea had these cartilage rings, and let's continue the neck to finish off. So all of this is human body. We'll see those cavities. I have not colored them, or these spaces for oral and nasal cavity. Those I've left uncolored, and all the tubes that follow after them. But rest of the body I've just quickly colored in. So rest of this head that we see here. Like I said, our uvula hanging, our chin, our tongue. Of course, the proportions in diagrams often are not exactly correct, but they're there to explain a concept, and sometimes it's useful to emphasize things even though it's not completely to the scale. So we won't worry about that. What I wanted to show here is that our pharynx actually covers this area here. So the back of the nasal cavity, back of the oral cavity, and continuing all the way until we get to the larynx. So this all is our pharynx. So most posterior part there of the oral cavity and nasal cavity. And pharynx can be actually divided into 3 different parts. So let's go through those. So first of all, we have nasopharynx. Nasopharynx is this area immediately behind the nasal cavity. And now that we're talking about digestive system, that's not going to be important for us because that's really used only by the respiratory system. We should not have food or liquid going to the nose. The next one is going to be the oropharynx that's located behind the mouth. So that's the part that's shared both by respiratory and digestive system, as well as the same is true for the laryngopharynx, which is the part again shared by these two and right above the larynx. So here. So those are the three parts of the pharynx that we covered. I do want to mention again a term that I think is a useful one to know. A fancy term for swallowing is deglutition. So that's a term that you can sometimes see being used when we talk about swallowing process. And it is noteworthy that swallowing starts as a voluntary process. So you can choose to start to swallow, but once the process has been started, you cannot stop it. Then it becomes involuntary once it has begun. You can't just start to swallow and stop it. So that is something to notice about that. Just a term and concept that I want us to be familiar with. So let's continue our journey. We're going to have a look of oesophagus. That's where I'm focusing next. And oesophagus is kind of a easy one when we talk about the digestive system. There's not a heck of a lot going on there. It is just a muscular tube, if you wish. There's not much that we can talk about it. So you remember trachea was more anterior and more posteriorly we then have our oesophagus. That's long and runs down to the stomach. What we notice happening in the oesophagus is that we have, because it's a muscular tube, these movements known as peristalsis, and we just discussed it at the beginning. It was this wave-like movement where the materials, the contraction of the skeletal band, muscle band, help to, or in this case, it's actually smooth muscle band, helps to move the material along this tube. So we end up finding that oesophagus works no matter what position you're standing in. So it's not really gravity that helps to move the food from the mouth to the stomach. Even if you're standing on your head, you can still swallow water or swallow food. It travels up this oesophagus in that case, thanks to these peristaltic movements. There's very little digestive functions that I can think of. It's really mainly just about the transport in here. So not a lot to notice there that would be of an interest for us. It's kind of an easy one to cover, so no digestive functions either. Oesophagus, you remember from our earlier discussions, whenever it's not being used, it kind of shrinks or collapses. When it is being used, then it opens up into this larger tube so material can go through. So that's something to think, and that kind of makes sense if you think we don't want the oesophagus to be open too much, because otherwise we would probably get a lot of burps, a lot of backflow of stomach acids, food from there, a lot of heart. One thing that is noteworthy is that if we think here, I'm going to draw just a quick sketch, that we have our diaphragm, which was the thick muscle sheet separating the thoracic cavity from the digestive cavity. We have oesophagus passing through it. That's one of the very few structures that actually puncture through the diaphragm. And then underneath that, we of course have our stomach. So oesophagus is one of the few of those that pierce the diaphragm. Two others that I can think of course, we have our aorta, so the main blood vessel coming through. And then we have our inferior vena cava, which is bringing the blood back to the heart. That passes through the diaphragm as well, but there's not a lot that goes through it. So that's kind of a noteworthy little thing to just notice regarding to that. If we talk about the stomach, one thing to notice there is that there's very little absorption happening within the stomach. Stomach is too acidic, its contents, to really be excellent for absorption. There is digestion happening, but no absorption. So material does not move across this plasma membrane. As we talked, what was the absorption at the very beginning, we discussed that. Why is this the case? Well, first of all, stomach is very acidic. We also have the thick mucus layer. The thick mucus layer protects the layers of the stomach so that the acids don't digest them. And a lot of digestive enzymes and so on are inactive or lowly only active within the stomach because of the acidic environment. So they really start working only at the later part of the digestive tract. So there's really not that much absorption going on. What is the term that I want you to notice? So we discussed earlier on about the bolus, how that was the mixture of saliva and broken down food that was made at the level of the mouth. Now we get a new term. This term is called chyme. When we mix the bolus with stomach acid, we no longer talk about bolus. Now we start talking about chyme. Chyme is much more liquidy, watery, if you wish, in terms of its consistence, and runnier. If you've ever had tea runs, you'll see that that's very liquidy that comes out. Other thing that I wanted to mention about the stomach is that stomach can shrink and extend a lot, depending on whether your stomach is full or empty. So this shrinking and expanding is largely thanks to the fact that the stomach has these ridge-like folds inside there. So they can give us more surface area if we stretch them out, or they can pack this surface area into smaller. So these are known as rugae. And they are especially visible when the stomach is empty. We see those ridges. I also went through with you parts of the stomach. So let's have a look of those just quickly. So we saw earlier on here when we discussed, we saw the oesophagus coming in from here, right? So that's our oesophagus structure that we already know. So let's go through parts of the stomach that we do want to know. We're going to start with cardia. Cardia is this first part of the stomach right after where the oesophagus has came in and joined the stomach. So it's this first part that we notice here. The part of the stomach that's actually higher up, if you look at this diagram where the oesophagus joins to the, I didn't mean to do that. Where oesophagus joins to the stomach, you'll notice that it is a little lower than the very tip of the stomach, very top part of the stomach. So that part that's above this line is going to be called fundus. And I wouldn't be talking to you about fundus unless it be useful for us or important structure for us to know about. So I'm talking about this part here. And why we want to know fundus is that gases tend to build up here within the stomach. So because the oesophagus is lower, there's nowhere place for these gases to go. So they end up building up there. And you can see that in medical imaging, for example, quite a lot of the time. The rest, the largest part of the stomach really is going to be our body of the stomach. So major portion of that. That's a term that we use to describe that. And then we have our pylorus. So what is pylorus? Why is it important? Well, pylorus is the last part of the stomach, most distal part of the stomach, and it could be actually further subdivided, but for us, I think that this level of detail is just sufficient. So if we're going to stick from talking pyloric antrum and pyloric canal, we'll just are happy with pylorus. After that, we would then get the small intestines. But we're not yet ready to talk about the small intestines. Instead, I want to add two more structures here that we should know about. So what should we know about? We should know about two sphincters. There's one at each end of the stomach. So the more proximal end, the part that's closer to the mouth where this all starts, that's known as lower esophageal sphincter. So it's at the bottom of the esophagus before the cardia. We have this muscle band structure that squeezes this part closed, ensuring that material doesn't flow back into the esophagus. If there is backflow into the esophagus, we do tend to get something that's known as acid reflux. And acid reflux was also known as a heartburn. So heartburn has really nothing to do with the heart, if you wish to be correct in your description. Instead, what happens is that we now have a failure of this lower esophageal sphincter that we just talked about, and some of the stomach acid gets to flow to the esophagus. And esophagus is not adapted, it's not designed to deal with something that acidic. So that really irritates the esophagus. And as a result, we get this pain sensation that we call heartburn. So how we treat heartburn, we try to eliminate some of that acidity. So you get anti-acidic medication that helps you to bring down the acidity of the stomach. So until this sphincter works well again, it doesn't irritate the esophagus. Problem that could come if we don't deal with it, if there's a constant irritation of the esophagus, you might end up developing ulcers in your esophagus. Worst case, if the ulcers were bad and they would still be irritated, that can make you more prone to also develop esophageal cancer. So do treat your heartburn if you do get that. That's not something that happens immediately, but something that we do want you to be well. We don't want you to live with constant heartburn. So it's worth checking. The other sphincter at the distal end of the stomach, so the end further away from where the food comes in, that sphincter is known as pyloric sphincter. And what's interesting about pyloric sphincter is that that's actually something that we can see that is anatomical sphincter, whereas the lower esophageal sphincter, it's not really visible if you dissect into a person. It's just a physiological sphincter. But the pyloric sphincter is definitely some muscle band that we can see. Pyloric sphincter controls that when we are ready to let the contents of the stomach in controlled manners to the small intestines, so we let it go in the amounts that are manageable, so we don't overwhelm the small intestines. If you have, like I said, diarrhea that runs, you would see that sphincter would be just letting things go through. Okay, I want to also mention a couple of words about a clinical condition known as hernia as it relates to the stomach. As it relates to the stomach and esophagus. So hernia referred to bulging of whether it's a tissue or an organ, but something bulges through an opening where they shouldn't go through. So for example, here stomach would bulge through that opening in the diaphragm that was meant for esophagus, and it starts to come through there. So let's add hernia to this diagram. So if the stomach would actually start to bulge through from there and come up there, that would be our hernia. And of course, that's not something that we want to happen. That's not ideal. It's not always a disaster. Some are more severe, some are not hernias, but we do want to check on those, that if something like that happens. The other thing that I wanted to talk in terms of clinical relevance was gastric ulcers. So that's when we have stomach acid that damages the lining of the stomach. This can be also because of bacterial infection or even overtaking aspirin in too great amounts. This would then damage the lining of the stomach. And this results in pain. And how we are treating it is again, we don't want stomach acid to be rich and strong there. We bring that down, and we might need to use antibiotics as well to treat this individual. So we don't want to have gastric ulcers either. So I think that covers our stomach, with the exception of two little things that I want to add. There's always something with us, isn't there? I want to add, I'm just looking for a color that I can use that I haven't used yet. We can add two curvatures. So lesser curvature is on the more medial side. It's showing this inside curve that we see. It's not quite as large in terms of the size, whereas the greater curvature is on the lateral side, and it's this larger curve of the stomach. So two terms just to be aware of. Now, I think we're ready to talk about some secretions of the stomach. And I do have a diagram or a list that I've reviewed with you before. So I'm not going to go into great detail of that. But you remember, this all kind of revolved around, if you wish, of the presence of stomach acids, hydrochloric acid. And stomach acids were secreted by our parietal cells. So let's have a look at what stomach acids do. Well, we have pepsinogen, which is one of the secretions from the chief cells in the stomach, but pepsinogen itself is inactive. But once it gets mixed with the stomach acids, it turns into pepsin, which is an active form, and that plays role in protein splitting. So that's very good for that purpose, responsible. Oh, I didn't mean to change the color of this. It plays major role in splitting the proteins, provided that I can highlight that there. The other secretion that I want to talk about that we have from the stomach is gastric lipase. And you remember lipids. Lipase refers to fats. So it's responsible for splitting fats secreted from the chief cells. But what we notice, it's very weak still in the stomach. This is because of this stomach acid making it weak. So only once we are leaving the stomach and go to the small intestines, gastric lipase can work optimally. So this is what we find in a lot of the secretions within the stomach, that they don't work optimally. There's poor absorption going on because of the presence of the highly acidic environment. A couple of other things that are secreted within the stomach, a lot of mucus. So mucus protects the stomach wall. It forms this thick layer to the stomach wall so it doesn't self-digest, secreted from the goblet cells and mucus glands. And final one that I want to mention is the intrinsic factor that's responsible for playing major role in vitamin B12 absorption and secreted from the parietal cells. So that's something that we might know there. Just don't want to cover the letter numbers 12. So I already earlier on asked that why do we have poor absorption within the stomach? And I started to answer that, but let's go through the rest of the answer to that. First of all, the environment within the stomach is very acidic. And most enzymes, like I said, don't really work that well in highly acidic environment. So for that reason, there's very little absorption within the stomach. The other thing that we notice is that there's not a lot of villi within the stomach. We did find rugae, but those are bigger. Villi were these small microscopic folds on the surface of a structure. And what they were doing, they increased the surface area so there was more surface area to absorb things through. Well, we don't find a lot of them in the stomach, so there's not really a lot of surface area for absorption. And the final concept, and I kind of referred to this earlier on, is the fact that we have a lot of mucus forming this layer on the surface of the stomach that makes it hard to pass, protecting stomach itself from acidic environment of itself, so it doesn't self-digest. Let's have a look at the small intestines next, and I'm gonna just pick color from here that we haven't used a lot. I think that we're gonna use this time. Let's use this. So we're gonna talk next about the small intestines that are starting there and look through all of them. So small intestines are anywhere from 2 to 4 meters long in length, about 2.5 to 4 centimeters in diameter, so not huge. These are the main site of where the absorption happens. So this is the business end, if you think of the different parts of the digestive tract. This is where absorption happens. And this is because we do have the large surface area, so a lot of villi, microvilli, and in fact, the surface area, if you spread out the small intestines, is about size of a tennis court. So there's a lot there that we can absorb material through. And we're going to go through the different parts of the small intestines. And again, I'm just going to bring us back up to the speed by drawing. Here was our esophagus, and here was our stomach, right? Let's color that in. So it really is a sac-like structure, especially when extended. So now we get to the small intestines. And small intestines within the digestive system are typically kind of in the middle of the abdominal area. So they leave the sides for the large intestines, if you wish. And there's 3 parts of the small intestines that we want to know. Duodenum, which is the first about 25 centimeters, curving around the pancreas. So we can add our pancreas here. We'll talk about pancreas a little later. Oh, I didn't mean to highlight it. We can talk about pancreas a little more in a bit, but pancreas is located here, so the duodenum kind of curves around it a little bit, about 25 centimeters in length. After that comes jejunum, which is about 2.5 meters in length, and then ileum, which is about 3.5 meters in length. Students often ask me that, okay, duodenum makes sense, but where does jejunum end and ileum start? And to be honest, there's no definite spot. It's more of a conceptual change. There's no anatomically visible change between those. How do you remember the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum? They sound like words that I don't think you guys, at least, I'm not very finding them that, oh, that makes sense, sounds logical. I use a mnemonic. I think of DJ Ill, someone who plays very sick music. So that helps me to remember the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. If that helps you, use that. If something else helps you, use then that. What we end up finding in small intestines is that we've got few different secretions there, mucus and peptidase. Peptidase broke down the peptides into amino acids. Then we have a bunch of sucrase, maltase, lactase. They break the disaccharides into monosaccharides, so more simple ones. Remember, we're breaking large molecules into more simple. And we had our lipase, which was, of course, to do with breaking down fats. So that those were the ones that we highlighted when we discussed about those. What I do want to say as we finish off talking about small intestines, that the last part of the small intestines was known as ileum. So the transition point from small intestines to the large intestines is called ileocecal valve. So we have ileum, that's where the ileo comes for this term. And the first part of the large intestines is actually called cecum. So that's where the cecal comes. So the large intestines start here, and this valve that I've just mentioned, that's a junction between these. So we're again able to control what can pass from small intestines to large intestines. So that's our ileocecal valve. So let's have a look of the large intestines. Large intestines' main role really is in reabsorption of water. So at this point, our chyme is still very liquidy, it's very runny, but we want to recover the moisture from it because otherwise we would lose a lot of water. So that's what the large intestines does. And when we remove the water from the chyme, we are left with feces. So once the water has been removed from the chyme within the large intestines, we are left with feces. We no longer talk about the chyme. Parts of the large intestines that I want to list, I mentioned the first part, cecum. So again, let's do a quick diagram. I think that those help us as we go through structures. So here we had our esophagus, our stomach, right? Everyone still with me? And we're gonna take our small intestines, starting from the pylorus of the stomach. So duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And we remember the duodenum wrapped around our pancreas. Now, let's go through the different parts of the large intestines. And I mentioned that the first part that we saw was cecum. And from a cecum, we have this little thing hanging often, which is known as an appendix. Appendix is really something that can get infected. They might have to remove it. So why would we have something that can give us trouble if we don't need it? We can live perfectly fine without appendix. Well, there's no definite answer, but the best explanations at the moment are leaning towards the view that it's an evolutionary remain from our earlier ancestors. That's where the bacteria that were involved with digesting the plant-based material, that's where they lived. And slowly over time, it probably is gonna disappear then. the next structure, next part of the large intestines that we're going to cover is going to be our colon. So often you can think of the colon kind of frames the abdominal cavity, whereas the small intestines were kind of in the middle. The colon then kind of frames that, forms that structure around it. And of course, they're not as smooth as on this diagram, but we're going to try to keep things simple for the sake of my artistic abilities being limited and so on. So the green part here is going to be our large intestines colon. And let's discuss different parts of the colon. So we're going to start with the ascending colon. So ascending colon runs on your right side and runs from the bottom to the up. So mainly from the inferior part of the abdominal cavity to the superior part on the right side is our ascending colon. Then we get to talk about our transverse colon. Well, transverse colon crosses from the right side to the left side at the superior part of our abdominal cavity. And then going down on our left side of the abdominal cavity, we have descending colon. So going downwards on the left. And then the final part is known as sigmoid colon. And how I think of the sigmoid colon, I think that it looks a little bit like a S shape. So that's my rule for thinking of that, the sigmoid colon. And of course, then we have the very last part of the large intestines. That's gonna be our rectum. So we could add it if we wanted. There. So that's our large intestines. Like I said, main function to reabsorb the water, and we're left with feces. The last thing that we have to talk about the digestive system is going to be our accessory organs. So let's have a look of our accessory organs. And there's 3 that I want to focus on. And we're going to start with the liver. So liver is the largest gland in the body. It's made of 4 primary lobes. There's few structures that you can revise for your practical, and some vessels that might be good to know. But really, there's a load of functions, a huge number of functions that the liver has. I think I once started listing them and I got to about 100 and then I gave up. I decided that life is too short. I've got better things to do, but liver does a huge amount of things. You can think of all the detoxification, cleaning the blood, removing components, old components from the blood, storing energy, as we discussed, and so on and so on and so on. But the most important function of the liver for us, in a sense of digestive system, is that liver produces bile. And bile is important dietary substance because it helps us to break down especially fatty material. So bile is produced by the liver. And as liver produces bile, the bile travels down the common, down the common hepatic duct that we see here. And it goes to the gallbladder. Oh, I didn't mean to lose my tools. Let's get it back. So bile travels to the gallbladder. This is a sac-like structure here at the very bottom, at the inferior surface of the liver. And to get in there, bile has to travel this cystic duct that we see here. Same as when we're releasing the contents from the gallbladder, then we travel through the cystic duct to the bile duct that runs to this opening here to the small intestines. We remember that what we see here is the first part of the small intestines, the duodenum. So this bile duct opens to there. In terms of the gallbladder, really its function, if you wish, is to store and concentrate bile. So it does not make bile, it is liver that makes the bile. Bile gets stored and concentrated within the liver. Another thing that is worth of noticing clinical relevance, the gallstones. So they are when cholesterol escapes from the bile and forms these stones within the gallbladder. They can be painful, they can be an issue that we might need to look at. And the final structure that I've added here that I want to discuss about is going to be our pancreas. So let's add that to our diagram. And pancreas is really one of these organs that's favorite of ours as anatomy and physiology teachers because it's both endo and exocrine organs. So you might remember when we talked about our endocrine system, the hormones at the beginning of the semester, we saw a lot of functions for pancreas, but for us, now that we're looking at the digestive system, really the biggest function is the production of the pancreatic juice. And pancreatic juice is really the most complete digestive secretion. So it does very good job in digestive processes. And if you look, the pancreas has also pancreatic duct, and that opens at the same place where the bile duct opened to the small intestines. So these two ducts join together and dump their contents into the duodenum. And this opening is actually known as hepatopancreatic ampulla. So that's a structure to know regarding that. And a couple of final thing to just wrap up our discussion of the digestive system. I mentioned this earlier on, but I just want to make sure that we're completely comfortable with that. We do, of course, eat food, but once we've eaten food and we mix it with saliva and the food there's been mechanical breakdown at the level of the mouth, it becomes bolus. And then we saw that the bolus traveled, that was easier to swallow, it traveled down the esophagus and reached our stomach. And now when the stomach gets mixed with or the bolus gets mixed with stomach acids, it became chyme. And then the last term that we need to know regarding this series is when we get to the large intestines and we recover the water that's in our chyme, we now start talking about feces. So that's all we need to know about the digestive system. And we're going to have a look of the male and female reproductive system. We're going to go through them a little quicker. But before we do, I want to go through a couple of key concepts and key terms that are going to be important as we do that. So the first term is going to be gonad. So gonads refer to our primary sex organs. So for the males, that's of course going to be the testes, and for the females, it's going to be ovary. And both testes and ovaries produce sex cells, but also sex hormones. So remember that it's not just the production of the sex cell, and we do call sex cells actually gametes. So that's another term to notice. It's not just that. We also produce hormones. That's important for us. So this male sex cell is of course our sperm or spermatozoa, which is a term that you might see being used sometimes. And for the females, it's the egg cell, ova or oocyte, depending on what textbook you're referring to. In addition to that, of course, male sex hormones, androgens, and mainly testosterone, are what's being produced in the testes, and on the female ovary, the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone are going to be important. And we're going to have a look of those as well. All other parts of the reproductive tract are then considered as accessory sex organs. So the primary sex organs, gonads, were testes and ovaries. And we're going to review all parts, but I want us to be clear about this concept. That's something that's quite important for us to know. And let's have a look of the male reproductive tract first. And there's going to be the tract, and then there's going to be a bunch of glands that we want to be familiar with. And I have provided you actually really nice diagram. Here you might remember back in the day, we drew this together. So that should be somewhat familiar. Here we see the testes, male testes. And of course we have two, one on each side. Their function is really the production of the sperm, but also production of the sex hormones, like we just saw. So that's gonna be important, and those were androgens, mainly testosterone. On the surface of the testes, we have this coiled-like tubular structure. And this coiled-like tubular structure is known as our epididymis. Epididymis is where the sperm goes to mature and also wait until it is needed. So it's kind of a storage place as well. After that, the next structure is going to be this long tube that we'll see. And there's a few different names that you can see being used about it. It could be vas deferens, or ductus deferens, or ductus deferentia. All of those are possible names that are being used about it. So that's just something that we need to accept and be aware that there's different terms that are being used, but they all mean the same structure, this long tube that we see here. And you'll notice that this tube is muscular, so it's very good at transporting stuff, just like we saw the peristalsis in the digestive system. Other thing that's noteworthy here is that we have this urinary bladder that we're arching above and then to the back of it. So that's why vas deferens is so long. It has to go that all the way there. And the end part of vas deferens is actually an expansion, if you wish. It's kind of a larger blob at the end of the vas deferens. That's known as ampulla. So we can add that to our diagram here. This one here is going to be our ampulla. Now, I want to add a couple of tubes. We're going to start with those. So let's get them to our diagram. And I'm going to start with our ejaculatory duct. Ejaculatory duct is a tube that's only reserved for the secretions of our reproductive system. So it's not shared with the urinary system at all. It's simply for the reproductive system. The other tube that we want to be familiar on our revision is going to be our seminal, or is going to be our urethra. Let's move on to that. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. How come it was so strong? Oh, well, I don't know. So let's choose a different color then. We're going to use this one for our urethra. So urethra is the part of the tubes, or is the tubes that are shared both by urinary and reproductive system. So both of those share this tube structure, and you'll notice it comes from the urinary bladder, and then the ejaculatory duct joined it. And we've got a couple of other structures that we want to cover, but we now know these tubes for the rest of the male reproductive system. Let's add some glands here. We've got 3 that I especially want to talk about. And I think we should start with seminal vesicle. So what seminal vesicle does? Seminal vesicle is here, and at this point, the sperm has traveled a long distance from the testes first to the epididymis, where it was maturing and waiting to be used. Then it's released from there and travels via vas deferens all the way to the ampulla and to this point of the ejaculatory duct right at the beginning. Well, it has used most of its energy probably, so seminal vesicle really provides kind of a boost of energy. It's really fructose-rich secretion, so great for making ATP and in this way propelling the tail of the sperm cell. The next gland that I want to add here is going to be our prostate gland. And prostate gland is responsible, I'm just going to use a pen this time, responsible for also releasing its secretions to the semen that's produced as the mixture of secretions and the sperm. But what's noteworthy is that both ejaculatory duct and urethra travel through the prostate gland. So that's something that's going to be important in a clinical sense, because what happens sometimes, and this is not uncommon, this is quite common in older men, about half of us face this after 40 years of age, is that the prostate gland can start growing, and this growth can cause that these tubes that go through it gets constricted and we are no longer able to empty the urinary bladder properly. There might be issues with the sexual behavior. We are not able to meet those needs as well, and so on and so on. So that excess growth would be an issue. How we deal in an ideal case when it's just excess growth, not cancerous, not something that we have to worry. We just basically cut a slice of it, like from a pizza slice, and that opens up these ducts enough that that can happen for the things to flow. I also wanted to add this diagram. Oh, that color did not work. Let me find another color. Let's use this. I wanted to add a gland that's known as bulbourethral gland, or sometimes you might see it being called Copworth's gland. Secretions from this gland are released in response to sexual stimulation, and again, they join here, as you can see, to the urethra and contribute to the semen, which was the mixture of sperm and all these secretions. So that's the ducts and the glands. Final thing that I do want to add here, and again, I'm looking for a color that I wouldn't have used before. I think that this will do fine. Is going to be our erectile tissues. We have corpus cavernosum and corpus spongiosum. These are responsible for the penis to getting hardening, which enables us to enter it into the female body easier and get the sperm released as far into that system as possible. So that's really, if you think, the main big function of the erectile tissue, that it helps that insertion to work. And we can, of course, have issues with erectile tissue, challenges with that, but we're not gonna really go to that discussion on my BIO201. We have a discussion about the discovery of the Viagra. So that might be something that if you find medical research and all that interesting, you might want to read up on that, or you'll notice that on my YouTube page, there's all of my also BIO201 videos available, so you can find it out yourself if you're interested. What happened there? How did this work? How did this come about? So that's really the male reproductive tract and all the parts that we need to know about the anatomy and physiology of it. I want to add a couple of things to this though. I want to mention scrotum. So scrotum is this muscular sac hanging behind the penis underneath it. We can highlight it on this diagram if you wish. So scrotum would be here. So our testicles are located there, same as our epididymis and the first part of the vas deferens. Why we have that is that this is really vital for the sperm production. So sperm production is optimal in a temperature that's 3 Celsius degrees lower than your body temperature. So by having this scrotum that's outside your body allows us to reach this temperature that's a little bit cooler. There are muscles that are then responsible for making sure if it gets cold, for example, to pull the scrotum up or elevate the testes. So dartus muscle is responsible for pulling the scrotum up, cremaster muscle elevating the testes. And next thing that I want to do, I want to talk about the parts of the sperm, and we're going to do that quickly, but I think it is something that's worthwhile to revise just so that we remember the different parts and their roles. So I'm going to draw here a sperm cell. A diagram, of course, it's not to the scale and it's not necessarily the prettiest diagram, but it will help us to go through all of these different parts. And then let's start with the head of the sperm cell. So the head of the sperm cell is where the genetic material is housed. So that's where the half of the DNA of the child, so the DNA from the father's side, come from. And another thing that's important that's housed within the head of the sperm cell is digestive enzymes, or enzymes that play a role in penetrating the outer layers of the female egg cell. So the sperm has to make its way through inside there, and that's not an easy task. And there's you remember, competition of multiple sperm cells to achieve this. So the sperm cells use these enzymes to get through that structure. The next part of the sperm cell that I want to mention is going to be our midpiece. And what we end up finding within the midpiece is that there's a lot of mitochondria there. And mitochondria, if you remember, they were the cellular powerhouses where most of the ATP is being made. So they are what provides energy for the rest of the cellular processes. And that would make sense. Why would a sperm cell then need a lot of energy? Well, it needs energy to be able to do this swimming function that it has. So we provide energy for the tail, which is responsible for the locomotion by producing this ATP. And that's why we have a lot of mitochondria within the midpiece of the sperm cell. And you might remember when we talked about the male reproductive system in terms of the anatomy and physiology in general, that once the sperm had traveled up the vas deferens and we got after the ampulla, we had this seminal vesicle here that released fructose-rich nutrients for the sperm cell. Well, this is what would have happened here right now. We give a boost for the sperm to continue this journey of swimming by giving these fructose-rich secretions that can be then used for making ATP. A couple of things that I want to mention. I'm not going to get into this in deep. I just assume that you revise it if you don't know. The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So we have our good old friend hypothalamus, and especially the anterior pituitary relevant here. Hypothalamus produces the gonadotropin releasing hormone, whereas the anterior pituitary follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And of course, testes then produce the testosterone. Testes were our gonads. So if you're unfamiliar with that, I really encourage you to look back to your notes, look back to the lecture videos, and you might even want to go all the way back to our discussion of the endocrine system. So that's something that I'm going to assume that you're fairly comfortable with. So our hypothalamic pituitary gonadal, sometimes abbreviated as HPG axis. So I think that I provided quite nice notes to read through them. So we'll leave it to that here. I also want to mention, just as a final thing about the male reproductive tract, let's have a look of the amount of testosterone throughout the lifetime. So right after birth, we have this surge of the testosterone in plasma. And that's important for the driving all of those male characteristics on a young newborn, all the way up to roughly to 9 months of age. And then once we enter the puberty, we have this second huge surge of testosterone. And that's responsible for the secondary sexual characteristics to appear. Important or an interesting note here is that the testosterone levels remain high very far into the life, and then only later on, after 60 years or so, start to slowly decrease. Some individuals prefer to get supplementary testosterone, so they might find that beneficial. But that's not the case for everyone, absolutely. Let's have a look at the amount of the sperm as well throughout the lifetime. So sperm cells are there, but they mature only at the after puberty and after that, and sperm counts remain high very far into the old age until then they decrease. But this is why males are able to become father when they are still older. So just something to note there. So that's the male reproductive tract. I want to discuss about the female reproductive tract quickly before we wrap up this review session. And in terms of the female reproductive tract, we're again going to start with our primary sex organ, which is of course going to be our ovary. So the functions of the ovary was the production of the egg cell, which we're going to know as ova or oocyte, but in addition, making those sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So remember that it's not just making the cell, but also the sex hormones. Now, when we look at the female reproductive tract, the next structure is really interesting to talk about. That's going to be our fimbriae. Fimbriae are, if you want to use your imagination, a little bit like these finger-like structures, just smaller in scale. And they kind of are around here, ready to catch the egg cell from the that has been shed from the ovary. One noteworthy thing here that I do want you to notice, which I think is again interesting, is that the egg cell from the ovary is actually shed to the pelvic cavity. There's no physical connection between the ovary and the fimbriae. So the egg cell for a while travels outside this tract, and then these fimbriae kind of catch it back, rescue it back to the female reproductive system. But remember that there's no physical connection between the ovary and fimbriae. The next structure is going to be our infundibulum. Infundibulum is this, if you wish to describe it as a cone-shaped structure that helps with kind of directing the egg cell towards the remaining structures. So it kind of narrows down this tube that we're following. And we're going to discuss through the different parts of the uterine and fallopian tube. What's important there is that we notice that it is muscular tube, so again helps with moving materials there through those peristaltic movements. There's also a lot of cilia there, so again wiping the material along the way to where we want it to go. It kind of helps to move this egg cell. So it's really all about the transportation. That's important there. I guess I could put the egg cell here that's being moved by this cilia. There's two different parts of the fallopian tube or uterine tube that I especially want to discuss with you. And the first one is going to be our ampulla. So ampulla is this longer part. It has a thinner wall, and it's very wiggly, very curvy. And what's interesting about ampulla is, oh, and let me just correct the fundibulum there, is that it is within the ampulla where fertilization normally takes place. So the egg travels here and meets the sperm here. So the sperm has made all this journey inside to the female reproductive tract to make it to the ampulla, where it then gets fertilized by the sperm cell. This is why sperm can survive in the female body for up to 3 days to make this journey to this part of the tract. And let's have a look at the second part of the reproductive tract. This is known as isthmus. So this is much thicker piece of the uterine tube wall, much also straighter, shorter, and connects to the uterus. And what I want to do, I want to go through the different parts of the uterus with you as the next concept that's important for us. If you think of the function of the uterus has a role of receiving the fertilized egg cell and also making sure that that fertilized egg cell and the pregnancy that has resulted can be maintained. So that's the role of our uterus. And let's start with the fundus of the uterus. And fundus is a term that you might have heard before. It's the roof of the uterus in this case, so it's always the kind of very top part. We saw that, for example, with the stomach, the top part where the gases tended to build up. That's a good example of that. I also want to show you the body of the uterus. So body of the uterus covers about 2/3 of the entire size here, forming a major part of the uterus. And the final bit that we have to look at of the uterus is going to be, and again, I'm just looking for a color that we wouldn't have used. I don't think we've used this one. Is going to be our cervix. So cervix forms the final third, if you wish, of the uterus, protrudes inside the vagina a little bit. So in this way, we are able to take the cervical smears without having to go too far in to the female reproductive system. For some reason, that did not like to work, that pen, so let's use this. So here's our vagina where the cervix protrude into, as you remember. So the question, I guess, is from me, when we've followed the path of this egg cell that got fertilized within the ampulla, where in the uterus do we want it to implant that? It's going to travel to the uterus, but where in there? Well, it can implant anywhere, but there's two places that we prefer, one place where we don't prefer. Well, we would be quite happy if it attaches to the fundus or to the body of the uterus. We hope it not to attach in general to the cervix of the uterus, because what will happen, we will need to form a placenta, and if placenta forms over the cervical opening, then during the delivery there is a risk that we end up tearing the placenta off first before the baby is born, and that would of course be problematic. So for this reason we do the early ultrasound scans. They are done for a purpose, not just because you're excited to see the future child, but to make sure where in the uterus the fertilized egg cell has implanted. Of course, we have a few other external genitalia of the female reproductive system. And then we have various ligaments. And again, I'm not going to cover those ligaments. I kind of expect that you know it. If you don't, refer back to the lecture video. Our ovarian ligament, suspensory ligament, and broad ligament. They can be seen on this diagram, but again, if I start to add them, this will become so busy that it makes no sense. And of course, remember, I've only drawn one side of the uterine tube and the ovarian structures there. The final big concept that I want to discuss regarding the female reproductive system is going to be the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle. And I can actually give you at this point heads up that this is going to be the extra credit question in your exam. So there's going to be a question where I ask you to explain the female menstrual cycle to the level that you feel comfortable. I'm not expecting you to draw diagrams. It doesn't have to be a long answer. It's just writing what you remember. Remember, that's extra points. So you do the best you can, and that's completely fine and completely enough. But if you are aiming for that grade point, grade final grade, and you want to get those extra points, this is a good time to listen what's related to the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle. So here we see our hypothalamus, and underneath it we see our pituitary glands. And we're going to be especially interested on the anterior pituitary gland in this case. So let's just color our anterior pituitary gland here so it really stands out as we discuss what happens in the hormonal control. Well, what we notice is that anterior pituitary gland secretes gonadotropins. And there's two gonadotropins that I want us to look at especially. The first one is our follicle stimulating hormone, so abbreviated often as FSH. And you might ask me, what is a follicle? Follicle is this sac-like structure where the egg cell develops within, and once the egg cell is ready, it gets shed out from this follicle, and there's still some follicle left behind. And this is going to be important when we look at the remaining hormonal control of what happens in pregnancy and what happens if there is no pregnancy. But just as the name would suggest, it does what's on the thin follicle stimulating hormone, controls the development of this follicle. That's what it does. And here on the next step, as you can see, we're shedding the egg cell during ovulation, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what's left behind is the remaining parts of the follicle. So that's something that's noteworthy to make a note of, that follicle and remains of it still stay behind, because this will play an important role in later stages. Okay, so I think that we have discussed about follicle stimulating hormone pretty well, what it does. It controls the development of the follicle. And follicle contained the egg cell, the oocyte. Well, the other gonadotropin that's going to be important for us is going to be luteinizing hormone, abbreviated as LH. And what luteinizing hormone does, once there is a surge of luteinizing hormone, as you can see here on this graph, that triggers the ovulation to take place. So shedding of the egg cell gets released. Ovulation takes place as a result of a surge in luteinizing hormone, the egg is shed from the follicle. So that's the important role of it. And I mentioned earlier on that the remaining follicle is going to be important for us. And the remaining follicle actually becomes a structure which we know as corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is simply the remaining parts of the follicle, but corpus luteum starts to secrete hormones on its own. And what these hormones are is important in terms of what happens as well. So the first hormone secreted by corpus luteum that we're going to have a look of is going to be our estrogen. Estrogen is secreted as an ovarian hormone from the corpus luteum within ovary, and presence of estrogen really plays role in thickening of the uterine wall lining. So when there's estrogen being secreted by the corpus luteum, the wall of the uterus keeps growing thicker and thicker and thicker. And if you think, why would this happen? We want to have a thick uterine wall lining so that when the fertilized egg cell reaches there, it implants there nicely and has a good chance of growing and succeeding and becoming to a new individual. The other hormone that's being secreted by the corpus luteum is progesterone. What progesterone does, progesterone makes this uterine wall lining very glandular. So we start to form these glands that are depressions on the lining of the wall of the uterus. It also makes the uterine wall lining very vascular. So all of this is again preparing us that it's easy for the fertilized egg cell to implant there, and there's a lot of blood supply available. Formation of the placenta is easy, and so on. So that's the role of estrogen and progesterone. And if there is a fertilization, the corpus luteum actually gets salvaged and it will keep secreting these estrogen and progesterone, and that will result in the uterine wall lining being maintained. However, if there is no fertilization, let's look at that. In that case, the corpus luteum degenerates and as a result, estrogen and progesterone secretion ends. And when the secretion of estrogen and progesterone ends, what happens is that as a result, then we will have the menstrual bleeding. So we will shed the lining of the uterine wall, and there will be also bleeding involved as we get rid of this thickened and vascular and glandular uterine wall. So menstruation takes place. And this is really all that happens in the hormonal control of the female reproductive cycle. I think that that's a fairly simple once you get your head around. There's a lot of concepts that are separate, but when you bring them together, it really tells a full story. And I have had some students sometimes who have protested that, oh, well, this is easier for females to know because they've got an internal working model of the hormonal control of menstrual cycle. I can assure you that they don't know what hormones are being secreted. So this is just as fair extra credit question for both sexes. So unfortunately, everyone has to learn and memorize it. It's not something that we just know off the heart. If you want to prepare for your exam for that extra credit, you can write the question, answer to this question, what's the hormonal control of the menstrual cycle ahead of the time on your notepad or on Word doc, and then just copy paste it to your exam. So I'm giving the question ahead of the time in case you want to do that. Remember though that I'm not asking for anything amazing. Simple paragraph is more than enough. Maybe 4 or 5 sentences, whatever it takes you to explain what we just revised, but I'm not expecting even half a page of the text. I'm just simple description what happens. In case you're chasing for that a letter grade A and you feel that you have some ways to go, that might be something that might be useful. I'm not saying you have to do it. Remember, it's just an extra credit question, not a required thing. You can still get 100% from the test, even if you don't even attempt it. Couple of last things to wrap up the female reproductive system. In terms of the menstruation, there's a couple of terms that I just want to mention. Menses is the proper term that we prefer to use when we talk about the menstrual bleeding. There's menses taking place, and the first menstrual cycle of a girl is known as menarche. So menarche is the first menstrual cycle at the puberty that the girl will go through. And of course, then we have menopause, which is the cessation of the menstruation and menstrual cycle. We clinically look at once the menstrual cycle has ceased for 1 year, the female has gone through menopause. So that's the clinical criteria for that. Just a couple of words about the mammary glands. Mammary glands, again, something that I think that you already have covered, but we do have mammary glands present, of course, both in males and females, but they are functional only in females. And the function of mammary glands is, of course, the production of the milk. And we produce the milk for nourishment of the newborn after the pregnancy is over. If you want to look at these glands, there really is modified sweat glands if you want to classify them. And again, I have more information in the full lecture video, but for the sake of revision, I think that does as well. And that's the completion of this study guide that we've looked through together. There's a lot of material there, but at the same time, it's not a huge amount. So only 3 chapters. I want to keep the exams manageable. Remember, and I'm going to jump back to our presentation, but still keep talking. Remember, the exams as well as the practicals are open book. So you can use your notes, you can use your textbook, whatever floats your boat, use it, make it so that you have optimal chance to succeed. I don't publish the study guide in full with the answers anywhere, so you do have to join me either for one of these live sessions or watch the recording, which I assume that you're watching now. And let's just see if we get the computer. It's running a little slow, but it's doing the best it can to cooperate with us. So what we're seeing is the study guide for the exam. So we've covered that. You also have a nice list of terms for the practical that you might find useful. Many students find it useful, of terms that you should know that are important. Remember, you also have this practice practical. So you can actually work through every single question that might come up in the actual practical. I really encourage you to tackle that. Work through it a couple of times so you see every single question pulled out from that pool of possible questions. You can use your notes, you can take pictures. Some students have even used their mobile phone to practice for the practical, so they have references. I really, really think that this is just a matter of preparing. I have provided handouts of the lecture slides. They're not exactly the same as mine for copyright reasons, but they are from your textbook and cover very much the same topic. As I've mentioned now a few times, the assignments, retaking those, having those opened or extended. We are approaching the end of the semester, so this is coming to the last times to do that. So make sure you get that tackled. Contact me if that needs to be done so we get those points for you. Of course, we do offer tutoring through the Cranium Cafe. You don't need to have an appointment. It's an electronic virtual tutoring service that we have, and there you can choose the tutor that you want to work with. If they're available, they'll meet you immediately. Otherwise, you'll just wait in the lobby until they're available. Finally, any questions? I've received quite a lot of good ones. I'm happy to answer those, so contact me through Canvas. That's usually the quickest. I tend to also be more than happy to facilitate one-on-one sessions if you have questions, or group sessions, or even others of these whole class review sessions. Just let me know how I can help you to succeed. My goal is that if you're willing to put in the work, everyone can get an A, but you have to put in the work. So I'm all about your success in this class. And that really concludes everything that I had for this session. We've spent time mainly going through the study guide for the exam 4. Like I said, remember, it's open book test. It's not proctored, but it is timed unless you have some sort of a special arrangement through the accommodation plan. So make sure that you complete it in one setting once you have started. If something happens, the connection goes off or so on, you contact me and I can reset your test for you. That's it for this review session on Wednesday morning. I really appreciate you having joined me. I know it's been a long semester. There's been a lot going on, but you are seeing the finish line. And if you can ace it during the pandemic, imagine all the amazing things that you can achieve once we get back to the normal. So you are definitely very, very much appreciated by me, the effort and good work that I've seen put into this class. I know that there'll be questions about the finals week project. I will explain that in detail on the next week. And I'll do a session for that probably on the Monday morning as well. You can follow the announcements. I'll make sure to announce that. Also, make sure that you review the exam 3 and practical 3 feedback. Those both are available now. The final grades are up there, but I didn't do a formal review session of the results. Instead, I've written a lot of feedback for each and every one of you individually. So that should do, instead of in the interest of time of using a session for that, that should do the job, and you can find the points that were worth of noticing. And I take time to write those, so I would really appreciate if you're able to review those as well. But on that note, I hope you have a good rest of the week. Remember, next week, it's probably going to take you 4 hours, maximum 6 hours to finish the finals week project. And then we can wrap up this semester. I'll let you know what grade you have achieved, and you can enjoy, hopefully, of a little bit of a break. I really have enjoyed working with you, and I'll see, hopefully, you next week, I would ask you to keep an eye. I do send a message on the canvas which tells you your final grade before the end of the semester, or so that you're able to see where you're standing with the grade even before the registry releases those. So that's something that I always do for my students. So keep an eye for that message that will reach you sooner or later. Thank you again for joining me, and thank you for all your great work this semester. Hopefully I'll see you next week, and make it a good week. Bye.